Hi everyone and welcome. We are joined today by Orit Gal, who is a senior lecturer at Regent University London for strategy and complexity. She is a complexity thinker who has a passion for designing solutions to wicked problems. Today she's going to be speaking about the secret to cities being rhythms and not structures, and what makes cities so resilient. Why do we need them more than ever? And what can we learn from them when designing systems change? So welcome, Orit, and I'll leave the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Rosima. So I will go through a small introduction of these ideas, and then I'm looking forward to our discussion. So let me just share the screen, and if there are any problems, let me know. I hope everyone can see this now.
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, cool. So let's start. So really, when you think about everything that is happening today, so much of the discussion is the kind of shocks that COVID-19 has created, with so many impacts on people's lives, and individually at the community level and at a whole national level. But of course, these kind of systemic shocks also create new spaces for building new things and creating new projects. And there are so many amazing ideas out there today. And I just wanted to highlight a number of elements that might help us when we think about whatever social projects we're thinking about putting together. So just a little bit about my specific approach and what I do. So I do something that is called complexity-led design. And generally, there are two main things to understand about what it is, obviously, without taking the whole slide. First of all, when you do complexity-led design, it's really all about looking systemically at any problem, any phenomenon, any challenge that you want to take on. And what that means is that you look at things from multiple perspectives, from multiple disciplines. So any phenomenon that you can think of will always have a cultural dimension, a political dimension, an economic dimension, and a technological dimension. And it's really all about understanding the tension that is emerging between those different dimensions and between what the current constraints in the system currently are and what the new opportunities actually provide us. So it's really about pulling together emerging trends. What I do a lot is trend analysis. So for any project I would usually analyze, hundreds of mini trends to see how they fit together and where they create actual potential. And the other thing that is very important to think about complexity-led design as opposed to other frameworks is that it's not about the what, it's about the how. So we operate in messy environments and there's so much uncertainty. So it's not about predicting what will happen, but if you have a deep understanding of how things unfold, which in complexity terms, there are a lot of laws of nature that you can follow. If you have a better understanding of how things unfold, you will be able to design much better solutions. So with this in mind, one of the key elements in any project and any idea that you might decide to take on, one of the key elements is scaling. So I'm sure you've already had an opportunity this week to think about great ideas and to come up with really creative solutions for different things. But of course, to make stuff happen and to have real impact, it's all about getting good ideas and then scaling them up. And then the question is, what are the challenges in scaling and what can we learn from really resilient scaling so that when we grow a project, it actually becomes even better and more effective? And this specific issue that I'm going to talk about in terms of cities comes from a very interesting study that has been carried out by the Santa Fe Institute, that is the leading institute for complexity studies. And they were looking at how different things scale. So they were looking at organisms and such as ourselves. They were looking at cities, they were looking at companies. So what they found is really, really interesting. when you think about all organisms, including ourselves, there is a certain pattern. You know, we grow very quickly and then we slow down, we age, we die. What is very interesting about cities is that actually when cities grow, it's an exponential pattern. Actually, the bigger they are, the more productive they are, the more resilient they are. So actually, they've shown that if you double the size of a city, you get more than 15% extra creativity, innovation, wealth per capita. All of these things actually scale up exponentially, which is why cities have throughout history have always been these kind of great hubs of innovation for any era of change. So the question is, what is it about cities that make them so effective and so scalable? And of course, the next question was, what do organizations do? How do companies behave? So we understand how organisms behave and we understand how cities behave, but what about projects or companies? Is a company more London or more lion? Well, it turns out that companies are more lion. So they scale up sublinearly, which is just like us or whales or any other organism. They initially grow very fast, but then they slow down and they die as well. So unlike cities, they actually lose momentum, they lose innovation, they lose adaptability as they scale. So when you think about what resilience really is, any great product, service, policy, if it's really successful, it actually starts with a really brilliant fit between the idea, the design of it, and the environment in which it is implemented. So there's this great initial fit. But over time, right, everything around us changes, right? There are new cultural shifts, new business models, new competitors, new technologies come onto the scene. And over time, what you see in all these types of projects and companies is what we call strategic drift. There's this growing gap between the initial strategy, which was amazing, and the actual environment into which it is introduced. And over time, this is exactly what hurts resilience. So when we think about if this is what happens to companies and projects, and it is unlike cities, what does that actually mean? Now, you might think that it's a really weird comparison, but actually cities and companies are just networks. So Apple is just a network of people doing stuff together, and so is London or Brighton or anywhere else. So the real question is, what makes cities successful networks? It's all down to that. If you want to create a really successful project, it's all about creating really resilient and successful networks. So I would like to highlight three interesting elements, three interesting dynamics in what I think that cities really work as successful networks. The first one is information flows. So any network is all about information flowing between different people so they can collaborate better and overall, help in the direction of travel. So think about how information flows in cities. So much of it is about random collisions. You would take your laptop and go and sit in a coffee shop down the road. Well, we used to do that a lot. Hopefully we will again. You meet people, you run into people, you overhear conversations, you get little signals of information. And when you have chats with people, it's much easier to identify collaboration because you can come up intuitively with ideas and kind of connect the dots. What tends to happen when we scale up projects is that you actually limit information flow. So obviously there is division of labor, but over time, as more and more people are connected to your project, there is much more limited flow of information between everyone. So an interesting thing to think about when you scale up a project is how do you maintain these random collisions, these disability of everyone within the network to pick up signals along the way. So as you can see, it's about designing for certain dynamics to take hold rather than designing for a certain outcome. The other very interesting element that really thrives in cities is that people can come and do anything they want, right? That's the big dream. That's what, all the New York movies are about. It's all about come and do your own thing. And of course, people join projects and join different initiatives for a wide array of incentives. And the more you are aware of those different incentives, different needs that people have, the better you will be able to incentivize them to really be proactive and experiment. And that is another very important thing in successful networks, that you allow the different nodes in the network to experiment and come up with their own ideas. Because if you're running a project, you will have a very limited view of what is happening on the ground, and you need to give people the legitimacy to try out things because they get the initial signals of information that they can play around with. Of course, when you let people experiment, you also need to tolerate failure. So another element when you think about how you scale your project is how much agency do your partners or employees actually really have? And this is really, really difficult, I find, when scaling up projects, because the initial tinkering and experimentation has happened at the initial stage, and then you think you have a model that you can work with and you just want everyone to do the same, but more of it. But that usually doesn't work. You need to allow the project to adapt itself to everything that is happening within the environment, and therefore you need to increase the degrees of freedom for people and the autonomy for action, which means you need to tolerate more failure. And the third one, which is very important in terms of resilience, and again, we see that in cities, is that there is redundancy of function. And I think that one of the most interesting ideas that is coming out of this post-COVID world is we're moving from thinking about efficiency to thinking about resilience. And resilience and efficiency are two very different things. So if you think about resilience as your ability to constantly adapt to new and uncertain conditions, it also means that inevitably you will be less efficient in terms of running your functions. So think about the London Tube, right? There, if you want to go from point A to point B, there will be multiple ways to get there. Some might be shorter than others, but if something fails, if there's a bad signal on the Northern Line, there will always be an alternative route. So that is another thing when you think about how you design your projects and the scaling up of your operations, how many routes do you build in to reach your core functions? And again, that is another very dynamic to think about. So just looking at these three examples, really building resilience is about managing degrees of freedom within your project, whatever it is. And it's really about managing tensions. So you want a lot of information flows, and you want everyone in your project to be able to directly connect with everyone else. Of course, you don't want to overload people and have too much noise. So how do you design and manage that tension? You want people to have autonomy to come up with ideas and experimentations, but also at the end of the day, you also want them to achieve certain objectives. So again, that is another very interesting design challenge when we scale up a project. And the last one, of course, you want to have certain redundancy and flexibility of functions within the system so it withstands shocks, but of course you don't want to have too much waste. So if you think about it, it's really about managing the dynamics between all of those elements that create really successful projects. And what is very interesting is that designing to create those healthy dynamics is not about big, bold, silver bullet solutions. It's all about continuous small interventions. I like to talk about it in terms of social acupuncture. You just constantly identify what the dynamics are and identify where you can intervene to make the dynamics really just healthier. So from a project manager perspective, from a leadership perspective, I focus more on the dynamics that are happening within the project, and it really doesn't matter if this is about policy or it's about a social enterprise or, it's an actual product or an app or something like that. The logic is the same logic in terms of leading the scaling up of that effort. So really, to sum it all up, as Osima said, it's really understanding that the secret to resilient cities are its rhythms. It's how the dynamics operate. It's not the actual structures that you put in place. And once you get that logic, there is so much creativity there to play with and think about how you enhance the right rhythms within your own organizations. So I think I will stop it here, and I would love, to start a conversation and hear your questions.
Thank you, Orit. That was amazing and so thought-provoking and really challenging to my mind. So I really and thoroughly enjoyed that. We're going to take it to the floor now for the questions, and I'm just going to read out some of the questions that people have already asked. So Jewel has asked, isn't there a tipping point from where upscaling starts to get unproductive and inefficient again, because there might be an optimal size for a system to operate at an optimal level?
That's a really interesting one. To a large extent, the constraints of the scalability emerge from the conditions on the ground. So again, if you think about the history of cities, the size of a city really changed over centuries and millenniums by the fact that people could move further distances. So if you think about very old cities, it was really how you could distribute food and how you could create markets. And if you need to actually walk the ducks to the center of town, you have a kind of constraint on the size of it. But as you could see, cities, of course, over centuries scaled up and up and up. And while you can think about cities also as fractals, as these embedded mini cities within bigger cities, there isn't an overall constraint of where it can go. It's really about then understanding the technological, cultural, economic, and political conditions that constrain a certain set of scaling, and then identifying where the potential is to scale it even further. So it's not a rule that there is an optimal size to things. It really depends on the specific conditions.
Yeah, thanks for that. So Jane has asked, where is the ecological dimension in the complexity model? Without acknowledging ecological limits, isn't ultimate collapse of the model being built in?
The ecology is everything. So when I talk of the political, economic, cultural, and technological, it really embodies also the physical and the material by definition. Mm-hmm. So that is really part of the whole environment. For me, the environment is, I talk about ecologies of operation. So the ecology is not a differentiated dimension, it's within all of that. So what is very interesting, if you look at the pattern of scaling up, what you also see is it requires real technological shifts or real change in how we organize ourselves. And here the limit is, and what the Santa Fe Institute research has also shown, that you kind of need to iterate and innovate faster and faster. So it's not this smooth sailing, absolutely, and it is constrained. And we need to be aware of those constraints on a constant level.
Yeah, for sure. Kester has asked, do you suggest any books to read further about the complexity-led design?
So it's slightly difficult because it's multidisciplinary. It's been very hard to promote it within academic institutions because they are inevitably constructed by disciplines. So there are a lot of like us little subversive forces within different elements. But I would look at a few different elements. First of all, go on the Santa Fe Institute website. They have loads of different resources. They have also free online courses. A lot of it is a bit more math-oriented and computational, but you don't have to do that. So a lot of really interesting resources there. If you can also find interesting readings around complexity economics. So people like Brian Arthur are very interesting to follow and find examples. And I find that just reading a lot of historical books on the evolution of anything. So, you know, it could be the evolution of forks, it could be the evolution of cities, it could be the evolution of computers, whatever you're into, by looking at the evolution of different social systems and innovations, you will find really the essence of what complexity-led design is all about. And of course, when you look today at design thinking for wicked problems, again, that's another area where you could find different case studies and examples.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So another individual has asked, what is your favorite city and why? I like this question.
Well, it's actually London, which I feel really fortunate to live in. There is a certain dynamism that I find in London, which is really fascinating. Unlike other cities, there's a lot more dynamism in what is happening at the local level, at the neighborhood level. I think that one of the elements is also how cosmopolitan it is. And again, looking back in history, the best cities were also always the most cosmopolitan, because you bring people from all around the world and they bring new ideas, and this is where the buzz and ideas come from. Especially on a sunny day like today. Tuesday, not so much.
That's true. So someone has asked, I've heard people advocating for more small community focus, staying local, etc. What do you think of this in relation to cities being more efficient and perhaps more sustainable and effective?
I think that actually there is a natural inclination here. The bigger cities grow, the more your life is actually local. So if you think about what your London is and what my London is and what anyone's London is, it's a different kaleidoscope. So a lot of it will be based around the area we live in, with connections to other main points that are just relevant to our lives. So I think that there are as many Londons as there are Londoners, I like to say, because we each have our own version. I think what is really interesting with working from home and other trends that I think that COVID has really accelerated rather than created, it is something that parts of it will stay, but the more I work from home, the more I want to go out and meet a friend for coffee later on and go into the park and actually go to some of the boutiques down the road. So it's always counter forces that work together that are really important. I don't think we should try to artificially constrain it, because again, the magic of cities are the random collisions between many different people and the new ideas. So I wouldn't try to advocate moving cities into a bunch of villages back in time. But I do think that strengthening the resilience of local communities, which is something we've all felt, and in a way the crisis has allowed us to live in a really interesting way. I mean, suddenly I know the names of all my neighbors in a way that was kind of awkward to ask before, but now you can actually ask people how they are. And I think we shouldn't lose that, and actually we should build on that, because it's really nice.
Yeah. And someone has asked, you mentioned the need to constantly innovate, but doesn't the philosophy of the need for constant progress sometimes blind us to the value that can be found from old solutions like the bicycle? I think you're on mute.
No idea what happened. Sorry. Is that fine now?
Right? Yeah, it's fine. We can hear you now.
I think that innovation is about finding solutions to new problems. And the key element is that you constantly have new problems that are emerging. So it's not really about finding new ideas. So the whole idea of progress is just, for me, about continuously adapting to whatever is emerging around us. And many times it is about old solutions or the recalibration, the repurposing of old technologies and old resources that we might have, ignored for a while. So innovation is about fitting, understanding the new challenges and understanding problems and fitting that with whatever solutions you can find. That's, for me, innovation. It's not about constantly coming up with, new technologies or whatever.
Yep. Adam asked, is COVID-19 harming the information flows part of cities since random collisions are deliberately suppressed to stop the spread of the virus? How should this be mitigated?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. Because you do have a loss of random collisions because you have much less people interacting over the city. So you do see that. On the other hand, because it created a shared purpose and similar problems in so many different neighborhoods and localities, you had a lot more local interactions. So I wonder if there was any way to do a study that would quantify it. But as I said, I know my neighbors now on a different level. You say hello to people on the street, what I call the familiar strangers, in a completely new way. There were a lot more local initiatives that were sharing information about what people need, what their medical conditions are, do they live alone, are they elderly? There was, I think COVID created different types of information flows at a local level that were also very useful. And the question is, how do we not lose that information? So there's always a difference between information and knowledge. So I think a lot of new knowledge has been created at a local level that we shouldn't lose. But looking at the long term, we need to get urban life moving back in order not to lose long-term momentum. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Kester has asked, do you suggest, we've already answered that one. Chris has asked, at what point can interpersonal relationships, as in family, be supplanted by economic, accounting, transactions, relationships in the course of scaling up?
Do you mean by actually quantifying the division of labor? Is that, I'm trying to understand.
What it is, though, because he wrote in brackets, accounting, transactions.
Again, I think that once you look at any phenomena as multidimensional, rather than traditional economic thinking, then obviously you understand the role of different people in the system in a completely new way. You might have a role of someone, I assume this is also about time division and what mothers do and all of that. But it's also, there might be someone in the system who might not be very efficient traditionally in what they do, but they make people smile and they connect them, and they just create a much better flow within the network. And that is something that, from an accounting perspective, you probably wouldn't define as a role, but it is so important for the way the network operates. So I think that we're completely rethinking what the role of different people within the system is and how we value it.
Yeah. Adam has asked another question. He has said, does scaling work on the level of countries and rightly justify globalization?
No. Scaling of countries is just an agglomeration. So what you actually see, for example, through 3 decades of globalization is you see, for example, a shift where you have much more leveling between countries. So the whole idea of past, developed versus developing world is completely useless as a notion for analysis. But you do have a lot more inequality and differentiation within countries. So between big cities and countryside, or secondary and third tier cities. So when you look at the patterns of globalization in that sense and the tensions it has created, it highlights the next challenges. So I think that so many great things have come out of globalization, but now it's about zooming in and seeing what it means in terms of natural local economies and how you mitigate those tensions rather than continue to look at very abstract national level data, which actually hides a lot of the real economic potential and risks.
And another question asks, can virtual collisions count, especially during COVID?
That's an interesting one. I think that there's a lot of innovations trying to mimic random collisions at a virtual level.
Why would you say that?
Sorry?
Why would you say how did you think that has occurred?
So, for example, I've been in virtual meetings where you have breakout rooms where people are randomly thrown into them, which I found kind of useful. I think people have been joining more network events, for example, such as this. You have more time, you're not running around town, so you can actually fit more meetings every day. So this allows, I'm sure that through this festival of change, there have been a lot of random collisions.
Yeah.
At the same time, I think that there is something about what we call the fourth dimension of human interaction, which is the physical one that just can't be recreated in virtual space. So it has its limits.
Yeah. So someone else asked, can you recommend certain networks or initiatives that work with complexity-led design?
I don't think that there is one specific model, but I think that if you look at any successful initiative and now look at it through the lens of complexity, you will see its essence. Because I think that because this is how we naturally operate anyway, we're social organisms. So throughout, human evolution, it's always been about scaling bigger and bigger networks to operate at a better level. Any successful initiative, any successful leadership or leader that you will follow, if you now analyze it through the dynamics of the network that they've been leading, you will identify it there. So I would actually do it the other way around. I would find projects that have inspired you or leaders that have inspired you, and then unpack what they've been doing from a complexity perspective.
Okay. And Leonie asks, do you think the innovation of self-service, whether checkouts in stores, online forms, rather than speaking in person in the name of efficiency, has helped or hindered us as individuals?
So it really depends. So you want to maintain human interaction in the things that count. But of course, if certain things are, easy to automate, the kind of basic need stuff, then why not? I think it increases productivity. I think that one of the problems is that we got so used to it that you just invent more forms and more elements. I'll give you an example from my university. I work at a university where most of us also do outside projects. So when it was smaller, actually each of us, decided to bring, visitors to give lectures, and we each had our kind of leverage in creating these events. And it was all done, manually or through speaking with whoever needed to organize it. as we scaled and as the bureaucracy scaled, they said, we should really organize this. And now you need to actually fill in 3 forms before you can get the guest lecturer to come. Yeah. And surprise, surprise, the number of guest lectures have really decreased. Yeah. So it's, when you need to manage, say, capacity in rooms and lecturing, it makes sense to have more forms, but at some point it actually hurts the dynamic that you're trying to create. Mm-hmm. So it's just about being really aware of what are you actually trying to do. It's like, it's really easy for me to do all my grocery shopping online. I don't need the human interaction there. It saves me a lot of time than going to the supermarket for 2 hours. So that's fine. But in other elements where I want to discover, when I want to be inspired, then I want to have the physical interaction in shops or whatever.
And those, in many cases, those are still there. So it's more like, in that sense, we have both options right now, but it does seem like the future is going more towards cutting most of that out.
I think it's cutting more out of the mundane and the stuff that really isn't interesting, but you just need to get through. But I think that we're going to see the disappearance of the middle ground in that, and the things that are really important for social interaction, for inspiration, for, just feeling alive and seeing people and people watching, all of that is something that actually our need for it will grow, and the experiences, the physical experience that we will be able to enjoy around that space will grow as well. So if you think about everything that is happening around experiential retail, or every pub down the road has special nights, whether it's quiz night or jazz night or whatever it is, it is those special needs that we're identifying now, and there is demand for it, and therefore there will be creative solutions for it, supply as well.
But would you think that because we have like our phones and everything online, so we rely on it more often, and more times we may spend time on like our phones or online for every outlet, like such as entertainment, shopping, all our needs, and that may also have an impact on us interacting with other people?
I think it does, but I think at the essence, we're social organisms. Mm-hmm. So everything, we've ever done, from hunting mammoths to building bridges to whatever, it's all about collective action. Mm-hmm. And I'm looking at also, through the lens of raising my kids, and obviously they're on their phone loads, but they're also really craving social interaction. So their mode of social interaction might be slightly different, and what they do with their friends is different than what I did, but it's still there, and the need is still there, and it just spontaneously happens to the same degree. So I'm less worried about that. I don't think we're all going to be zombies connected to screens in the future. Yeah. And actually, the last few months, where most of us have had to be kind of glued to the screen and work through the screen, also highlighted what we're missing.
Yeah.
In a way that we probably weren't aware of before.
That's a perfect way to put it. So another question has asked, interested to know your thoughts on gentrification and the often high cost of living in cities.
Yes, that is a really problematic one, because what happens is over time you decrease the diversity. So there is a real design challenge if you manage cities today of how you maintain that diversity, because if you lose it, then even thinking about random collisions, if you're only going to collide with people such as yourself, what's the point? And I think that cities are beginning to understand that. And I think what we're going to see, and again, thinking about COVID as an accelerator, what we're going to see is a lot more interesting projects around public housing, around short-term housing and housing exchange between different cities or whatever it is, to maintain that ability. I think it really highlighted what we need in terms of innovation and ideas and communities coming together, and who are the people that, the frontline workers that people might have not noticed really before, but actually you need them. Living within cities, what public housing is really all about. So if you think about even what happened in the 1920s and then architecture of public housing. So then it was tuberculosis, but then people identified that people need parks and people need balconies and people need more air circulation. So again, I think we're going to see huge shifts in those types of policies as well, in a good way.
Yeah, and with the big brands coming into, cities and almost taking over because they have shops and, properties everywhere, do you feel like that sort of gentrification may be taking away the community that is built within cities?
So there are two elements here. I think that the expansion of brands to have the same 5 shops on every high street is dead. That's gone. They've overexpanded and they cannot maintain. And if you look at the big chains, actually you see that they're cutting back. Yeah. And again, COVID is an accelerator, but it was the same trend. So I think we will see a lot more independent, interesting, quirky shops and services emerging out there. I think it's up to local councils to really manage that mix. Yeah. And find a completely different business model around high streets, because high streets, the demand is for the social interaction. The demand is to go out and see people. Traditionally, that demand was answered by a bunch of shops, but the accumulation of those shops don't provide what people really demand. So we need to rethink high streets not as accumulation of shops, but as ecologies. And therefore, how do you incentivize different mixes and give stage to different types of products and services on the high street without looking singularly at the business model of each of them? And I think that this is where really interesting ideas can come up from.
All right, thank you. And we've got the last question here, which states, is small beautiful?
No.
Why not?
Because at the end of the day, if you want to have real impact, you need to grow and you need to extend your impact to more people, more issue areas, connect with other projects and other things. So it's not that. So the question is, beautiful of what? If it is about just enjoying what you're doing on a small artisan scale, then that's brilliant. But if it is about systemic impact and systemic change, then you have to scale with all the challenges that are involved in scaling.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Orit, for giving us your time today. It's been really thought-provoking, and I'm pretty sure everyone who's been watching has learned a lot more about everything that you've touched on, and hopefully it will allow them to build a proposal, if they wish to send one, on how our economy can build back better post-COVID. So thank you very much. It's been
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.